Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. Today I'm going to cover the Brie Larson interview that she did in Singapore, and as usual I'm going to cover it in a way that no one else seems to have been covering it. I think it's important to go over it because a lot of the people are looking at it and they're actually really confused at what in the world Brie Larson is saying. And I'm sure you probably have that confusion a little bit in your mind as well, because she kind of sounds like she's speaking English, but she's making no sense whatsoever at some point. Or she says she's doing one thing when she's actually doing quite the opposite. You know, she says she's all for inclusivity and diversity, and yet she wants to exclude white men from actually interviewing her and things like this. All right, and I can see where the confusion comes from because trust me, I've had to go through this confusion myself. And it's because I have covered a lot of this exact same stuff over at Marvel Comics. And looking at all of their podcasts and stuff like that, which I have covered and no one else really seems to cover, because it's just such a dense matter. All of this stuff, it is. And really, honestly, I'll give you an example from this interview of what is just bizarre when she says it. This is Brie Larson saying, part of my interest in this talk of diversity is about talking about privilege. And it seems like from the video, there's no break between what she just said and what she says next, but I would say there was a break just from someone who actually creates videos. They splice it together at this point. But her next statement is, I'm very encouraged by things like how great the quality is on our phones now, that people have the ability to make things. That to me is the beginning of this next phase of the revolution, is saying like, how could we bring it down to this baseline level so that we could get to the stories that are just on the ground? Okay, that's one of her major statements in this interview. And if you listen to it, you scratch your head and go, what in the world are you talking about, lady? Quite honestly. And again, I have to admit, I had the same reaction a while ago when I started covering all of these things over at Marvel Comics. I had to go and do some research into actually figuring out how these people talk. Because a lot of people would say to themselves, okay, she's making no sense whatsoever, she must be an idiot. But I would encourage people not to take that immediate jump. I would say these people, when they sound like idiots, they actually mean something by what they're saying. You just don't quite understand their terminology, I guess. And that's the point. I had to do some research into figuring out what exactly are these people saying when they are saying it. And you're talking to someone here who studied political theory and had these radical feminist women's studies people in his ear half the time trying to ignore them while I studied something worthwhile. You know, and still I could not really grasp what in the world they're trying to say. And it took some research into doing so. So the first thing that you really have to realize when you listen to interviews like this, it is basically two woke people speaking to each other. You have two people and they know that the other one is woke. And so they speak in woke code, if you will, because they both know what they mean by the words that they use, even though no one else really out in the real world knows what they mean by the words that they use. And that's really the point. You see, these interviews are not what an interview actually should be. It's not what most of us in our minds think an interview is. You know, you would think that these people from this magazine or website or whatever are doing an interview with these actors because on the one hand, they're trying to sell their magazine. On the other hand, they're trying to sell their movie. But that's not actually the way these interviews are conducted. What is happening in these kinds of interviews is you have two woke people and they're having a conversation and you are allowed to listen to this conversation. This conversation really has nothing to do with you. And it's not for the intent or express purpose of informing you about anything. It's just that these two people are having a woke conversation and you are allowed to listen to the woke conversation. And possibly you might get something from it. So that's the first thing you got to realize when you're watching any of these video interviews or reading any of these interviews. But the point is this, okay? And it goes back to their woke ideology. These people use language in a way that normal everyday people don't use language. It's part of their ideology. Now, you and I and normal people, we assume that language is supposed to be understood by all, and it becomes understood by all by having a common meaning, which is grounded in things like reality and truth, stuff like that. And you know, that assumption actually is what is needed for things like rational thought and logic and science and all those funny little things. You know, you actually need to have that basis of your language connecting with reality. But these people in their ideology, and I won't go into it too deeply in this video, I might in another, but these people in their ideology believe that language has no connection to reality, has no connection to truth whatsoever. So they believe that language is untethered from anything. And language basically is just a plaything. It's a plaything that people use. And so none of these words that we use have an actual real meaning. And they can be changed and fiddled with as much as we want. And usually the way that these people deal with the changes in language, well, they think about it in a almost democratic way. I hate to use that word for this, but they say to themselves, well, let's get together a bunch of people and we'll see what the consensus is for the use of this word, and then we'll just use that definition of the word until we have to change it into something else. But the point is that when they look for this consensus, they are only asking other woke people to come up with this consensus with them. They will automatically exclude anybody who is not woke in building their consensus. And so these words that they use, a lot of these words that they use, which you and I and normal people think we know the definition of, they are using them with a definition that has almost nothing to do with what you and I think the definition of these things are. So I'm going to go over a couple of things from this interview to show you what I mean. And after showing you what I mean, I'll show you how this has an impact on what the future of Marvel looks like. So in this interview, they have a little bit from Brie Larson and a little bit from Anna Boden and Ryan Fleck, who are the two directors of Captain Marvel. And the interviewer says, what do you think it is about the Marvel movies that has themes that always resonate with people? And the answer, partly what Anna Boden gives, is it's their casting choices, and also, which goes hand in hand with that, their decisions to make movies about superheroes that are complex, interesting human beings and relatable human beings. And the interviewer asks this follow-up question. How has your process changed in making movies like Captain Marvel? And still making it feel grounded and intimate and personal? And the answer this time was from Ryan Fleck. And he says, the goal was always, how do we infuse the movie with the intimacy and the humanity that we access in other movies? All right, so that seems like a pretty standard question and answer. And the answer seems to be pretty understandable just to you and me. But you have to look a little bit deeper. Because when they use this common word that they're using over and over again in their answer, complex, interesting human beings, relatable human beings, intimacy and humanity, what exactly do they mean? Well, they're using human and human beings in a way and defining it as something completely different from what you and I would think the word actually means. And how do I know this? Because I have read several interviews with Anna Boden about this movie. And she talks about it in the other interviews as being, quote, not just a feminist movie, but also a humanist movie. And then she goes on to talk about things like Brie Larson being a, quote, absolute lady, and what it means to be human, and that Captain Marvel is an eccentric woman-like character. And then she talks about being unequivocally human. All right? Unequivocally human. So when she uses the word human, she is using it in the definition of humanist. Now, humanist, in its definition, its loosest definition, is rejection of everything classical, rejection of everything old, rejection of all of those old structures, all of those old ideas. Those are all out the window. And how does that play out? Well, that plays out by untethering your hero, quote-unquote hero, from any of these older ideas of hero, as I talked about in other videos. And the point is, as they say here in their quote, to talk about things and think about things in an intimate way. Talk about humanity and intimacy, which denotes that the way that you're supposed to interact with this character is not through those old ideas of things like being a hero, not in those old rational ways, but through feeling. And that's what they're always pushing over at Marvel Comics as well. You interact with these characters through feeling, only through feeling. So when they're talking about being human in this interview, that's what they're talking about. All right, they're talking about an abandonment of all of those old ideas, especially those old ideas of hero and those old ideas of being an ideal in any way. And they're putting it down to, no, you have to access this simply through your feelings. So you see, that is the woke way to interpret what they're saying. So let's get into one of the quotes from Brie Larson. She wasn't asked the question in the interview that we can see, but she says this: "I've enjoyed so much playing this character, and it's moments like last night that remind me that representation matters and that female complexity matters. That's so powerful." So here's another woke buzzword: representation. Now, they're always talking about diversity and representation, and most people think to themselves, yeah, well, I guess those are good things, diversity and representation, but you don't realize that they're saying diversity and representation in a identity politics kind of way. That's how they're using these words. Diversity does mean excluding some people, which would be white people. Males would be excluded, and with the white people, by the way, these SJWs are more and more seeking to exclude Asians as well. So it's not just white people, because Asians are typically very, very smart. So obviously they're oppressors as well. And here's where you go down a rabbit hole with what they're trying to say. Because in their minds, okay, this is the way they express it. Whiteness and maleness is lack. Color and female is filling up. So this is what they mean. That when you exclude a white person, say Brie Larson, excluding a white person from interviewing her, well, that's actually a good thing. Why? Because the white man who wants to interview her got that position by being an oppressor and by usurping the power of others, people of color and women. And so by actually allowing him to interview her, his oppression of other people that he used to get his position is bringing something to the table of that interview that is causing a quote-unquote lack, that is taking away from the interview. But when you actually bring in someone like this woman that she specifically asked for to do the interview because she was a woman of color and she was disabled, that's why she specifically asked for her. Well, that's not something that should be demeaning to the woman, that she got picked not because of her merit, but because she was female and because she was disabled. That's the only reason they picked her. Well, she should feel very good about that. Why? Because when she brings her color and her femaleness to the table, that is filling up. That is to say, she is bringing something to the table that will increase the, I don't know what you'd say, productivity of this actual interview. That's what they mean by when they say diversity. They do exclude people when they're saying diversity. They're saying we want some people and not others. They're not saying we want everybody. All right? They're not using that word in the way that normal people would use it and say, well, they mean everybody, right? No, they don't. And when they say representation, that's an identity politics word as well. They always talk about it in, well, the girls see these people up on the screen and they see them behind the camera and they say to themselves, I guess I can do that too. But they're using representation in a completely different way. Representation for these people is to put someone out there who is an image of their particular identity, so that these people, so you have Brie Larson, she's a woman. So you have other women that can use Captain Marvel and Brie Larson as basically like their idol, their totem, their image that they can all rally around and gather their power around according to the fact that they are female. And so they use her as a representation to consolidate their power and usually become a movement. That's what they mean by representation. Now, I'm sure you probably never heard anything like that about representation, but these are the specific words that they use over and over again, and they have this meaning that only they know. And when they put them in these interviews, it's because, of course, as I said, it's two woke people actually speaking to each other, and both of them know what they mean by these words. Another one would be power and empowerment that they use all the time. When they took this interview and put it on their webpage as a print article, it's entitled Women Empowerment, What Captain Marvel Means to Brie Larson, Cast and Directors. That was the actual title for it. All right? And when they use the word power, you know, most of us out here in the fandom would say, well, what are they doing? Why are they talking about power all the time? Do they mean it in a way because this character has superpowers and they want people to identify with the superpowers and say, I can be powerful too? I'm not really sure. How and why are they using this word over and over again? What does it mean? And usually that's where your mind goes. You try to connect it to something like that. But again, It means nothing like that whatsoever. When they're talking about power, they're talking about something that has a completely different definition. And they changed this definition, by the way. There is such a thing as male power and female power. Usually empowerment means female. When they say female power, they mean something different from power itself. Because power, when they usually use the word alone, is male power, which is part of the patriarchy. That is to say that male power is person A, who is a male, taking his will and imposing it upon person B so that person B does the will of person A. So that's, your patriarchal power. That's what they mean by power. And when they use female power or empowerment, that is a female way of looking at power where the person can enact their own will without anybody else infringing upon it. And this is really the central one, which is extremely dangerous because they use it in a way that is close enough to what people think of as power, but then they bend your idea of power into what they think it is. Because when you hear even the definition of it, they want to change it into so the person can execute their own will without anybody else's will interfering with it. And that's their definition of power. And you say to yourself, well, yeah, that's a good thing. What's wrong with that? Doesn't sound like it's a bad thing there. But again, you have to compare it with what this means according to the destruction of those old ideas which they're trying to get rid of. Because this idea in their minds, how you execute your will according to them, is by imposing your power upon things. Whereas the old definition of how you execute your will is through virtue and a correct understanding of reality, because the head of all the virtues, even for the ancient Greeks, was prudence. Prudence is correct decision making according to reality. So you see, they start using a definition which is similar to the one that you're used to, and then bring you into their ideological fold by saying that, no, this is the way we use power now, and this is the way we use will now. Will is dependent upon the power that you can exert upon reality, and even bend reality according to the power that you have, instead of the old ideas where you say, no, we want to execute our will by actually making correct decisions according to reality. And every time these articles and these people that are doing the articles and the interviewers like Brie Larson talk about power, talk about empowerment, that's what they mean. Because their whole ideology is centered around power. So with those kinds of definitions in mind, let's go back to Brie Larson's original statement that I was looking at, the bizarre one, where it seemed to be spliced together by the people doing this interview. Now, they wouldn't have spliced it together that way unless they thought that those parts of the interview naturally tied together. And the complete quote from Brie Larson once again is, "Part of my intent in this talk of diversity is also talking about privilege. I'm very encouraged by things like how great the quality is on your phones now, that people have the ability to make things. That to me is the beginning of this next phase of the revolution, is saying like, how could we bring it down to this baseline level so that we could get to the stories that are just on the ground?" So I want to dissect this statement and show you what it means for both Marvel itself and especially the MCU. So we take all of what we're talking about and look at what Brie Larson is saying here. She says in this interview and in the print part of the interview, and oh, by the way, both the print and the video are linked in the description if you want to go check these quotes. So in the print part of the interview, she talks about she is recognizing her privilege in so much as she is recognizing that she was allowed to be able to become an actress and to use all of her privilege to become this actress. That's what she talks about in the print version. So what she's talking about privilege here and how it ties in with the what seems like nonsensical statements about the revolution and cell phones is the following. She has privilege. And she recognizes that privilege, and she used that privilege in order to become an actress. And she got to join up with a whole bunch of other people who, like her, recognize that they are woke. So everyone around her in Hollywood, and especially in this Marvel movie, I would say, because she has already said that her activism just coincided directly with what they wanted to do with this movie. So all of these people around her, like her, are woke. So you have all of these people, these high-class people, these people who have privilege, and they're all woke. And why are they woke? Because, well, they were allowed to become actresses, and they were allowed to become directors, and all of these other kinds of things to make stories. Stories, of course, which you interpret only through feeling. And so what she's talking about here, about cell phones, is the fact that, look, Everybody now has a high-resolution camera that they can go out and make their own little movies for. They can go out and tell their own stories. And this is why one of the directors was talking about the importance of females in front of the camera and behind the camera, because again, she's feeding into this idea that, hey, guess what? You have a cell phone, you can go out and film yourself, you can be the star and you can be the director at the same time. And you can make your own story and put it out there, just like we are making our stories and putting them out there. And why should they do that? Why is that important? How is that the next step in the revolution? Well, because of course, they became woke by making these stories for other people and interpreting them through feelings. So they want these other people, these lowly people, these low-class people, you know, the common unwashed herd, which is us down here at the bottom. Since we have cell phones, we can now make our own stories, which can be put out there, interpreted directly through feeling, and as such, we ourselves, us the common unwashed herd, we too can become woke, just like they have become woke. And so they will bring their wokeness down to the baseline level, which is, of course, again, us, the unwashed herd of people. And so we will become woke the same way they do, by making stories about ourselves. And she's certainly not alone in this. I covered one of the writers for Marvel Comics who's now writing for DC Comics, and she also writes novels, which is G. Willow Wilson. She talked about the fact that her and all the people around her who are in the arts, they believe that the reason to get into the arts to begin with is to promote their activism, just like Brie Larson is talking about in the other interviews, that she's using these movies to promote her activism. This is exactly why they got into the arts to begin with. It is to preach to people. It is to take the progressive mindset that they have and to put it out there into the world, so that the common herd people in the world can eat it up, and then they themselves can become more and more progressive. And they'll just keep on going down the progressive road in this way. So this is what these creative people think their actual job is. They don't believe that their actual job is to produce a good product. They don't believe that they're out there to entertain you. No, they believe that as an artist, whether it be Brie Larson in front of the camera or these two directors behind the camera, they believe it is their job to bring their wokeness, to bring their progressive attitudes out to the people, so that the people can consume these progressive attitudes, internalize them, and they themselves can become progressive. That's what they see their entire life and their entire job as being centered around. And you have these exact kind of people now, behind the camera and in front of the camera, working on what is supposed to be the new flagship character for the MCU, which is Captain Marvel. And they are saying to themselves, well, look, the MCU took its time. It took 10 years, and it gave people what they wanted. But of course, we only did that so that we could gather up all the unwashed masses in this big herd. So now that we have them gathered up in this giant herd, and they'll listen to anything we say, now it's time to preach to them. So in a nutshell, what Brie Larson is saying here is that you need to go see the Captain Marvel movie. Why? Because it can show you, which would be minorities, women, people of color, it can show you that you can go and put out your own movie, you can produce your own kind of art through things like your cell phone, and you yourselves, who are just the unwashed common herd of people out there, you too can become woke, so that you can become, in the words of Brie Larson, the next phase of the revolution. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me how you like being sold a superhero movie so that you can become the next step in the revolution. Alright, I'll see you later. Bye.